breaking chains, burning ships, drowning in grace. This is 3 Nails X, breaking chains, burning.
Hello, and welcome to today's lesson where we're covering the non-triumphant entry, when Jesus enters into Jerusalem. This is the last week of Jesus's life. Very significant for the church, very significant for Christians to truly understand what is happening, because things heat up the last week of Jesus's life, and the last moments of someone's life are usually very, very important, as people tend to try to convey the last bits, the most important things they can before they die. And so as we're looking at Jesus's last week, that's how we want to be thinking through this, is the major things that Jesus is trying to show us as he leads straight into his death and resurrection. And so I call this the non-triumphant entry. Traditionally, it is called the triumphant entry, and I will refer to it from here on as the triumphant entry. But in reality, in Mark's version of this, it is not triumphant at all. It's very anticlimactic. And so we're going to jump straight into this triumphant entry. Here we go. So firstly, just want to point out that the triumphant entry is in all 4 Gospels. It's in all 4. And so we just want to take note of that you have Matthew 21, 1 through 17, you have Mark 11, 1 through 11, Luke 19, 29 through 40, John 12, 12 through 19, and this story being covered in all 4 Gospels. It's in all 4. It tells us something. What would it tell us? Like, just think about it for a second. What would this convey to us? That this is very, very important. Very important that it's in all 4. Where many stories are not in all 4 Gospels. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is not in all 4 Gospels, and that's considered Jesus's greatest sermon of all time. And so this here is extremely significant. Now, we are only going to be looking at Mark's today. That we're just going to look at Mark's 11, 1 through 11, see what it teaches us about the triumphant entry. Here's a picture, modern day kind of Jerusalem here. This here is the Temple Mount, all up here. This is the Temple Mount, okay? Jesus would have ridden over right now. This picture is on kind of the Garden of Gethsemane, kind of on that mountain there right outside. And so Jesus would have ridden up over the mountain. He'd go down. There's kind of a valley here, Kidron Valley, before he'd go up through. There's a gate right here on the right. He'd go in, and then he'd go up to the Temple Mount. That's kind of the process that he ends up following for this triumphant entry. Here's a picture kind of looking at it from the other direction. This is kind of looking at it from the Temple Mount. So Jesus would have come over this hill. He would have gone right down this path here. Most paths in Jerusalem tend to stay the same over a few hundred years, or very close to the same. And so Jesus most likely would have come over the mountain. He'd go down that road there. He'd end up going over, and then on this side's the temple, that entrance over there, and he'd go up to the Temple Mount. These here, your fun fact of the day, these here are all graves. These are all graves. If you go to Israel today, you can check it out. Jews believe that when the Messiah comes, the dead will rise again, and they believe that that entails the actual like bones from your past, like who you were, will actually rise again. That flesh and blood will go back onto it. Go back onto your bones. So people pay hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars to be buried right in here, because the thought is when everyone rises again, you will have the closest distance to the Messiah. So you get there first and you get to have a conversation with him and everything else. This is also kind of Holy Land just outside Jerusalem. So Jews are willing to pay lots and lots of money to be buried in this kind of plot here. So let's talk real quick about some background to triumphant entries. Because how I said that this is a not really triumphant, like this is non-triumphant, has to do with many cultural things that are happening here. So there's a process to messiahs during Jesus's day, and especially before, which we'll talk about some of the Maccabean brothers in a minute. But there's this kind of process that is considered always the same, and N.T. Wright really talks about this in some of his books. But the process is the same. What has to happen first for Jews for there to be a messianic type figure is there first had to be a time of intense suffering or a wicked ruler there, right? And that just makes sense. You don't look for a hero in a film if there's nothing wrong going on. So there's got to be something wrong going on. That's just common sense. To be a hero, there has to be some situation, some context that would help you become a hero, so to speak. And so there has to start with this wicked ruler, this intense suffering, okay? Now, a hero would then show up on the scene and they win some victories. Oftentimes, this is military battles, but sometimes it could be debates and other things. You just had to win some victories, and you typically had about a 3-year campaign. Which is striking because Jesus has a 3.5-year campaign. And after the 3 years of kind of winning some victories, often doing like guerrilla type warfare, after that time, you would reestablish the temple. You'd roll into Jerusalem, you'd reestablish temple worship. So you would clean it out, you would restore it back to its proper function, and then you would set up your throne. You'd set up your throne. And when you think about it, Jesus has done a lot of this, that there are wicked rulers, there's intense suffering during the time of Jesus. The Romans are in charge, right? Jesus, he shows up on the scene, he wins victories, he casts out demons, he gets in debates and wins debates and all that good old jazz. And after 3 years, he rolls into Jerusalem. And they would be expecting a establishing of the temple, but Jesus doesn't really establish the temple. He doesn't really drive people out yet. That's going to come. But this entire story from a more modern Christian perspective, we view it as victorious, as triumphant. But in their culture, this is strikingly anticlimactic. Especially if you contrasted this with like Simon's entry into the city and First Maccabees 13:51 and 52. You see, Simon was one of the heroes of the Hasmonean family that had defeated and driven out Antiochus. And he like drives them out, and he drives out the Seleucids. So early in the 2nd century BC, right? Judah ruled by kind of from Syria, ruled by the Seleucids. Okay, probably pronounced that wrong, but anyway, they're ruled from there, and they're known for being cruel. Antiochus becomes very cruel, and his effort to control Judah, he imposes Hellenistic culture, and he tries to eliminate central features of Judaism during that time. So in 167 BC, one of the Maccabean priests, a local priest, in a town northwest of Jerusalem, he initiates a rebellion. Okay, and the rebellion is led by his son, Judas Maccabeus. He becomes known as Judah the Hammer. Judah the Hammer. And Judah the Hammer rebels, and eventually, after his death, his brother Simon becomes the next kind of leader. And so Judah gained political independence under Simon, who continued to lead military operations. He liberated Judea and Jerusalem. He purified the temple from pollution by foreigners, an event that is celebrated and commemorated with the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. So if you know the story of Hanukkah, you kind of know this. That Simon, 171 BC, First Maccabees, 1351 to 52, you can kind of read about him. You see, they longed for a heroic figure. And they were looking for one who had charisma, who would lead a fighting force and drive out the Romans. Because ultimately Simon And the Maccabean brothers, they did this. They purified the land from the pollution of foreigners, just as Judah and his brothers did. This is what they're expecting. This is their hopes for a future Messiah. This is what they are expecting. The disciples' hopes were shaped by these legendary figures. You see, Judah the Hammer, Simon, like, there's more than this, but these were big people who shaped what Jews were expecting to happen and hoping to happen. But the interesting thing is, one very interesting thing, is that this is what they were expecting for redemption of God's people. They were expecting a Messiah to come in, set up his throne after doing these things. Judah the Hammer did it, Simon did it. And so this is what they're expecting. But Mark's narrative subverts these hopes at every turn. Right? The crowd is longing for a Messiah who's going to overthrow Rome. But Jesus continually tells people, be quiet, don't tell people about the miracles that I perform. Because he knows that Judea is filled with revolutionary fervor. Jesus is careful to avoid generating a movement that's shaped by Maccabean violence. Jesus preaches a cross-shaped kingdom and tells people to pick up their crosses and follow him, and not military triumph. But he will actually be handed over, tortured, and killed. You see, there is a history of triumphant entries, and even after this time, Simon the Star, he does it in 66 CE, like he tries it. And it doesn't work well for him. Not at all. And so we've got to recognize that when Jesus is walking in for this triumphant entry, that the church is often labeled as triumphant, it is actually staunchingly anticlimactic. It's anticlimactic. It's revolutionary because Jesus rides in on a donkey instead of a horse, showing what type of Messiah he would be, and then he gets up there and just leaves. It's fascinating. So let's jump into Mark now, kind of knowing this background. Let's jump into Mark and see what Jesus does. Mark 11, 1 through 11. As Jesus and his disciples approached Jerusalem, they came to the town of Bethphage and Bethany, on the Mount of Olives. Jesus sent two of them ahead. Go into that village over there, he told them. As soon as you enter it, you will see a donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, what are you doing? Just say, the Lord needs it and will return it soon. The two disciples left and found the colt standing in the street, tied outside the front door. As they were untying it, some bystanders demanded, what are you doing, untying that colt? They said what Jesus had told them to say, and they were permitted to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it, and he sat on it. Now, it is important just to take note that the colt, right, points to royalty, that you would often ride a kind of young donkey or a colt. And since no one else can ride the king's animal, this kind of has this pointing to that Jesus is royalty, the fact that no one's ridden it. Now, Jesus here, it's very interesting, right? Jesus tells them what they will find. They'll find someone, they'll find people, they'll find the colt, right? A young donkey tied there that no one's ever ridden. Untie it, bring it. When people asks, right? If anyone asks, what are you doing? Just say the Lord needs it and we'll return it soon. It's interesting, like Jesus' predictive power here. And it's important to note because as he's going to the cross, sometimes it is presented as if Jesus, it's all happening by accident, right? Some people are like, well, Jesus just kind of was this victim that just took it. But he's not an unwilling victim. He's not unwilling. Like, he is actually accepted and he is embracing the events that God has called for him. And he's walking in the way that God has called him to, right? Jesus is Lord. His royal coronation is his journey to the cross, right? So the disciples end up bringing Jesus this colt, which he'll end up riding. And this is prophetic. This comes from Zechariah 9:9. that a king will ride in on a colt, on a donkey. Okay. But this is very different than the Maccabean script. So just got to be noted again, very different. And so the crowd, they lay their cloak on the ground, okay, symbolizing their offering to him. And we'll continue on because that is going to come up here. So continuing our verses then, here we go, verses 8. Many in the crowd spread their garments. Okay, so many in the crowd, they see him come over this hill from Jerusalem. And they're on the road ahead of him. Now, this is going to be important. Ahead of him. And others spread leafy branches they had cut in the fields. Okay, so we got leafy branches. Jesus was in the center of the procession, and the people all around him were shouting, "Praise God, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessings on the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Praise God in the highest heavens." Highest heaven. Verse 11. So Jesus came to Jerusalem and went into the temple after looking around carefully at everything. Right? He looks at everything, looks carefully, and then he left because it was late in the afternoon. Then he returned to Bethany with the 12 disciples. You see, this is such a strange encounter, right? That he rides in victorious and then he hits the top and it's like, he looks around and he leaves. But there's this intriguing kind of note that's happening in here between verses 8 and 9. Okay? There's those who went ahead and those who follow. You see, proximity to Jesus matters in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples are called to be with Jesus. You can read that in Mark 3:14. They're called to be with him, right? So that they are acting according to Jesus's agenda. But what we see is that they actually they flip the script. They flip the script. They go on ahead of him. Jesus is in the center. See, the disciples are kind of not following Jesus's agenda. They are trying to get Jesus to be portrayed as this conquering king with the language of Psalm 118, where the Psalms celebrate God's deliverance through military victory. So they've gone ahead trying to present Jesus. The disciples seem to be trying to present Jesus as this like conqueror. And so Jesus isn't that way, though. They haven't been with Jesus. They're going ahead of Jesus. They're trying to force him to do something he doesn't really plan on doing. And so Jesus arrives at the temple, he looks around, and he leaves. And so in this timetable, this temple, it's too late. Jesus looks at it, judgment is already kind of declared. It's too late. God's timing, God's agenda, it is too late. Jesus is looking at the fruit, and there is no fruit, which will come up in Mark's gospel. And so just a few quick things to kind of note then about this triumphant entry is that many Jews, most Jews, would go to Jerusalem for Passover. Okay, many is probably the better term. Secondly, Hosanna. This word Hosanna means "O save." And so these people are acting according to the Maccabean script instead of Zechariah 9:9, right? The godly king of David will walk in Zechariah 9:9 riding a donkey, which is not the sign of a conquering Messiah. But on top of that, you have the cloaks on the floor, which often are talked about as representing submission to King Jesus. They're wanting him to be king. Palm branches often symbolize Jewish nationalism and victory. And so these are all the things that the people are doing. Just as the crowds had done 2 centuries earlier when they welcomed Simon into the city as a military conqueror in 1 Maccabees 13:51, these are the actions that they've done. And so they're trying to get Jesus. They're getting Jesus to fit this mold that he really doesn't fit. And when we start to think about this then, when we apply it to our lives, this is the last week of Jesus' life. This is really what kind of kickstarts the end here. For our kind of application, right? When we think about this, I got to sit there and say, like, just calling a spade, do we put Jesus, do we make Jesus into our image and make him hold our ideas and values? This is a question that we have to ask right off the bat is, do we form Jesus into our own image? Do we make him love the things we love or behave in the way that we want him to behave? A lot of times people emphasize certain stories of Jesus because they are values that they hold, but then they ignore other stories of Jesus because, well, we don't like those values, right? When I was speaking to a very wealthy Christian just the other day, they were emphasizing, all these stories about Jesus's teachings and loving your neighbors and all of that. And when I started to talk about, like the rich young ruler, give away all that you have and follow Christ, those stories we just kind of ignore, right? He just kind of ignored because it didn't lend itself to the Jesus that he wanted. You see, we got to get to know Jesus for who he reveals himself to be. We don't want to force him into a different mold. But we have been doing this for a long time. The church has been doing this for a long time. When you think about it, if you look up pictures of Jesus, you'll often find this white Jesus with long flowing hair who looks very beautiful, right? Like, you do realize Jesus wasn't white. So why do we have all these paintings of him being a white person with long dark hair? Well, that comes from Europeans. They started to craft a Jesus kind of in their own image. And this has become even more prominent even today. Stephen Prothero, he examines a number of ways Christians have made Jesus in their own image in his book, American Jesus, How the Son of God Became a National Icon. And he talks about how in the 19th century, the United States, the evangelical Christianity underwent like a feminine revision. And so he just talks about how it all shifted greatly during that time as Christians started to make Jesus in their own image. And so it's just something we have to be majorly aware of and we got to be careful of. You see, are you willing to give things up for the work of Jesus just like the man gave up his colt? And lastly, if we are honest, we often want a conquering Jesus and not a cruciform Jesus. This is a very dangerous thing. I run across Christians all the time who really want a conquering Jesus. We want to serve him when he's healing people. We want to serve him when he's conquering, when he's winning, when our president's in office or our governor is the way that they are, right? When we have Christian morals in our nation. But we forget that Jesus, he didn't come riding a horse. He came riding a donkey because he is a God of peace and he's going to be crucified. We don't like a cruciform Jesus very often. We don't like a Jesus who's crucified. We like a Jesus who conquers. You see, we inevitably make Jesus a champion of our own nation's interests, goals, and ambitions. We transform him into a conquering hero, into the image that we want him to be. We want him to fight for our cause. But we often don't like him crucified. But it's time to get back to the God that is. It's time to get back to the Jesus that is. Let's not make a God in our own image. Let's trust Jesus. Because a cruciform Jesus, that's who he came to be. That's what he came as.
Breaking chains, burning ships, drowning in grace. This is 3 Nails X.